Formula One and Son. I'm Tom.
And I'm Oscar.
Well, Oscar, we're here on Monday morning after the big race in Austin yesterday afternoon. We're both a little bit sunburnt, a little bit tired and weary after an awesome weekend at the circuit, watching all of the action. We were at the circuit from very early yesterday morning, watching US F4 races, the historic Masters, old F1 cars, all sorts of action. How did you enjoy your Austin race weekend?
It was amazing. Yeah, all the support races and just everything, the atmosphere, and it was just a great experience, honestly.
Yeah. And it was sold out. They put up on the screens as well, which is fantastic. And as you say, great atmosphere, beautiful weather the whole weekend. Kind of particularly yesterday sat around the kind of early 20 degrees Celsius, kind of 70 degrees Fahrenheit. And of course, we recorded qualifying and published that live. If you haven't already listened to it, you can hear our commentary after each qualifying session and an interview from a fan who attended the F1 Hollywood event, who is sitting behind us in the T12 grandstand. So go check that out if you haven't already.
Also, next year, if you're going to go next year, T12 is a great place to sit.
Yeah, so, T12 was really good. Yeah. For the uninitiated, T12 is at the end of the back straight, effectively. So it's the end of a DRS zone. It's one of the major overtaking zones. And as the nature of the layout of the circuit, you can see T12, kind of 13, 14, 15, 16. You can also see T1, so the first turn up the hill, and kind of the second section of the S's, can't you?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, so you can see quite a lot from that part of the field. There's a timing board there as well, or one of those big poles that has the positions, which was usually correct.
And then a couple... it started on lap 0 though, so that was kind of weird.
Yeah, it was confusing a lot of people.
A lap behind.
Yeah.
And there are 2 screens that you can't really see.
Yeah, you can see a little bit of a couple of screens. You can see them clearly. They're just a bit too far away.
Yes.
Yeah. So exciting to be at the race, but let's talk about the race. Obviously, the highlight is Lewis Hamilton wraps up a 6th world championship, putting him in the 2nd all-time world champion list, just behind Michael Schumacher. Yep. What an achievement! He did it relatively in style. We'll talk about the race. He had a pretty good race, but wrapped it up. They had a special car park reserved for him for the world champion. So it's a good thing he did wrap it up. It would have been embarrassing had he didn't.
Out in the first lap. They might have a little bit of time to wide it out. Just use that jumbo-sized wide out.
Yeah, but Oscar, you've got to think. You're obviously, newish to Formula One. You've been watching it for a few years now, but gotten serious in the last few years. You're witnessing, might be too early to call him the greatest of all time, but certainly one of the absolute legends of Formula One in your lifetime. In 10 years' time, 15 years' time, you'll probably reflect on Lewis Hamilton being the greatest ever driver who you witnessed win his 6th world championship.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. So huge thing. But let's get into the race. It was kind of one of those races that had some exciting segments, then some quiet segments. A lot of it did come down to strategy. Tyre degradation, I know it's boring, but tyre degradation played its part. We saw everything from a one-stopper from a few people all the way down to at least 3 stops by Alex Albon. Yeah, and to varying degrees of effect. There was no clear right strategy, I think.
And they all worked out pretty well.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that. Some battles really highlight that. So particularly the battle for the lead, Bottas and Hamilton on different strategies. Obviously, Leclerc on a different strategy. Norris and Ricciardo, really interesting. They fought all race but had different strategies. And a lot of this meant that there was some early fighting and then kind of a lull. And then towards the end, as those people on a multi-stop strategy were really fast, kind of catching those who are on one-stoppers.
Yeah.
So interesting. But let's go back to the beginning of the race. Oscar, relatively clean through turn 1, except for Alex Albon getting the squeeze on.
Yeah, by Sainz, he just kind of, I don't know if he got a puncture or not. It's not really clear.
He had some front wing. They had to change his front wing, but effectively he had to pit very early, didn't he, Albon?
Yeah.
Dropped him towards the back. So once again, we see Alex Albon having to do a recovery drive. Vettel and Leclerc, the Ferraris, I mean, let's be honest, a shocking race for them, but a really shocking opening couple of races. We saw Vettel in particular, just getting swamped, by the McLarens, by Ricciardo, by everyone. He was just falling back and back and back.
Yeah, and for a while it was Ricciardo, then Norris, and Vettel all locked into a battle that seemed to go on for a long time.
Yeah, and it was interesting. Obviously, Bottas kind of took the lead, got away, and then I think you had Verstappen behind him, and then Hamilton, and then Leclerc pretty much.
Yeah.
And then you kind of had... Yeah, these Renaults and McLarens in particular, Lando, Sainz didn't have a great start. He had a bit of that contact with Albon that we mentioned and uncharacteristically didn't have a great start. Ricciardo, I would say, uncharacteristically had a very good start.
Yeah.
And Hulkenberg had a bad start, uncharacteristically. A
It
bit
wasn't
of role reversal going on.
It wasn't a bad start. It was a pretty average start.
Yeah, but so what we saw, it was pretty interesting. So Bottas kind of shoots up the road. Nothing too much doing, had good pace. Verstappen didn't seem to be able to trouble him. Hamilton was kind of there.
Yeah, Hamilton got, I think, both of the Ferraris off the start.
Yeah, that's right. The Ferraris had a shocker. And we saw...
Verstappen as well.
Yeah. Verstappen it was Bottas, Verstappen, Hamilton for a while there, the first three.
Yeah.
And it was it was interesting with Vettel. Let's just go back to him for a second. Vettel was slow on that first stint for maybe the first 4 laps, and then started to find a little bit of pace.
Some.
Yeah, at least stopped dropping back off those guys. Started to catch up to the kind of Norris-Ricciardo
group. But don't
group.
worry, as soon as he found pace, he DNF'd.
Yeah, so that was fascinating, wasn't it, Oscar? He's complaining of massive understeers, so we wonder, did he have a mechanical issue from the beginning, which is why maybe he was so slow.
So basically, he hit a curb. His right rear tire.
Rear suspension, yeah.
His right rear suspension just went, I'm done, and collapsed.
It did, didn't it? Just, and so as a result, the right rear's dropped on the ground, the left front's up in the air, and that's his race. You know it's done right then and there. You got to wonder if he had some kind of issue from the beginning.
It's almost certain he did, though.
Yeah, fascinating. So that was Vettel done. He pulls to the side, actually did it quite well, so that it was a very brief...
It wasn't even a virtual safety.
Yeah, it was a very brief yellow flag, wasn't there?
Yeah.
And he's done. That's the end of his race. Kind of sad in a way. Let's then talk about the other Ferrari, because there's very little to say. Leclerc was kind of nowhere. He didn't have the pace of the Mercedes or Verstappen.
Yeah.
Was faster, though, than the next guys, the midfielders, your McLarens and your Renaults. And so kind of drove this fairly lonely race. Stopped, did a 2-stopper, I think. Looked like he might have some pace to come back, but then faded, never really did. So that's Leclerc.
Yeah.
Really, that's all there is to say.
Yeah.
A real fall from form for Ferrari this weekend. There's going to be a lot of head-scratching going on.
He didn't finish near him just because he pitted at the end to get the fastest lap, so...
Oscar, let's throw some controversy in here. Max Verstappen's alluding to the fact that it's because they can't cheat now that their speed has gone away. So there was this directive, I think it was Red Bull, one of the teams said, hey, we want to know if doing this fuel thing is legal. And teams will often do this. If they think another team is cheating or bending the rules by doing something, they will go to the FIA and say, can we do this thing to get a definitive ruling? And then the FIA will say, oh, no, you can't do that. And now that the FIA has made a ruling on such a thing, it means any team who had been doing that previously has to stop doing it. So Red Bull and I think Max Verstappen are basically saying, yeah, of course their pace has gone away because they can't cheat now. Matteo Binotto and Ferrari, of course, are vehemently denying this and saying, no, it had nothing to do with that. What do you think?
I don't know. I don't know. I didn't know this until you just said it then. So
they were fast in quali though, still, weren't they? So
yeah, I think they still have the straight. I think they still have the straight line pace. So
yeah,
I don't think so.
Yeah, so they were fast in quali. So that makes you wonder if that's true or not. Anyway, it's a bit of speculation, bit of fun. Max Verstappen stirring it up, taking some lessons from Christian Horner on how to be a complete stirrer. Let's go back to the front of the field. So Verstappen pits first, pretty early too, given he started on the mediums. We should say the top 6, actually the top 5, except for Albon, had the medium tyres. and the rest of them, so the midfielders and Albon, had the soft tyres, and this is because, of course, how they qualify in Q2. And so the medium tyre people, Pirelli had said the best strategy would be a one-stopper, mediums to softs, I
When's
think.
Pirelli ever right, though?
Yeah, Pirelli's never right. And, of course, it turned out there was quite a lot of deg. So Verstappen pitted it pretty early. I don't know what lap he pitted on.
The mediums had no pace, though. Like, it was like the softs were faster than the mediums.
Yeah, for some people, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Some people really struggled on various tyre compounds. So what we saw actually is some people starting on the hard tyres down the back, notably Hulkenberg.
Hulkenberg and Kvyat, I think.
Yeah, and Hulkenberg doing what trying to do what they did with Ricciardo in Mexico. So start on the hard tyre, run super deep, and see if that helps. Kind of worked out okay for Hulkenberg. He came in P9 in the end. But Verstappen pits pretty early. Bottas effectively responds to cover that off, doesn't he? Yeah. But Hamilton stays out. And this is where you get the usual kind of Hamilton calls of, oh, God. In fact, they called him in and he stayed out.
Yeah.
So
he was like, oh, my tyres are great. I'm not pitting.
Yeah. Well, and then he pits a lap later because his tyres weren't great. So Bottas, who had pitted earlier, starts to catch Hamilton at a rapid rate of knots. Just as he gets up to Hamilton, they say, hey, Lewis, why don't you box? And he's like, no, why don't I just stay out for a bit longer? But then did box the next lap anyway.
But proceeded to hold Bottas up a little bit because Bottas did overtake him.
Yeah, so this kind of put Lewis on a one-stop strategy effectively then, whereas Verstappen and Bottas were kind of on a two-stopper. And so Lewis stays out, has a pretty good lead. Bottas and Verstappen come in for their second stops. And Bottas immediately has mega pace, is taking huge chunks of time out of Lewis, and eventually catches him, but has to work pretty hard to overtake him in the end, and eventually has one crack around the outside at T12, right where we were sitting. Lewis squeezes him off the outside of the track. Next lap around, though, Bottas goes to the inside.
And not on the back straight. I think they overtake
at T12. At T12, he overtakes him again. Gets the job done. And of course takes the victory. A really solid weekend from Valtteri. He got pole position, got the win. That's his fourth win of the race, I think. Oh, the race. Yeah, he won the race 4 times on one day. That's his fourth win of the season. He scored more points than he has last season, so kind of via the metrics, he's having a better season than last season, but of course still just not on that level of Lewis Hamilton.
Well, he could have beat Lewis Hamilton this race. I mean, I don't think Hamilton's DNF'd this whole season.
That's good. Yeah, we'd have to look at the stats there. You might be right. He's on the longest point streak of any driver at the moment, I think.
Maybe. Yeah, I don't know if he is DNF'd, but...
I'm trying to think of a race he might have, but none is coming to mind. Because he survived Germany, whereas a lot of other people didn't, for example.
Well, he
came
almost didn't survive Germany.
So meanwhile, Max Verstappen was trying to get in and amongst this as well. He was catching Hamilton really quickly towards the end. But towards the end of the race, a certain Kevin Magnussen in his Haas, and we should say the Haas has had a shocking home race. The quali was no good for him. Race pace was looking pretty ordinary. And then once again, coming down to T12, the action zone where we were sitting, towards the end of the race, maybe 4 or 5 laps to go, he has brake failure. His front right brake, puff of smoke, gives out.
Straight into the gravel.
Yeah, straight into the kitty litter, and he's beached it, basically. This means that double-waved yellows are waving down there for the rest of the race. And it means you've got to lift off at a double-wave yellow.
Yeah.
This means that no one can overtake in the T12, one of the main overtaking zones. Max Verstappen probably would have got Hamilton without that. Maybe
Hamilton gets lucky again.
Yeah, or he needed another lap. But he was certainly, Max Verstappen was catching Hamilton at a rapid rate of knots towards the end of the race, but didn't get him in the end. So your podium, Bottas, Hamilton, Verstappen, well-deserved victory from Valtteri. Had to work for it. Great race weekend. Yeah. Hamilton racks up his
Of course,
World
Albon gets driver of the day because since he went straight to the back and had to do overtaking, he got driver of the day.
Yeah, look, if they gave out points for the driver of the day, you'd know what your strategy is. Fall to the back for some reason at the beginning as a lead driver, and then in your superior car, carve through the field. Now, Alex did this 3-stopper strategy, which is kind of weird. So it meant he had to carve through the field 3 times. It was, which he did. And he was impressive. It gave you something to look at.
His car is so much faster than everyone else's.
Yeah, good recovery drive, though. Albon comes in P5. We mentioned Charles Leclerc. He got the fastest lap in the end because he pitted for soft tyres and basically said, what time do I need to do? He had plenty of room behind him, so he pitted, did the fastest lap routine that we've seen a few times this year. Albon, good recovery drive to P5. And then for me, and this is because we're Ricciardo fans, as everyone that listens knows, and we should say, actually, I think after we recorded our qualifying interview, Oscar, some excitement there at the autographing session.
Oh yeah, we got autographs from Danny Rick.
You got to meet, at least in passing, Danny Rick and get our hats autographed, which was pretty cool.
Yep. Yeah. We also bought our merch later on.
Yeah, and you got a Gasly autograph on your Renault hat as well. He
passed by too.
So there was a autographing session, and they had Toro Rossos there, McLarens, Renaults, and Red Bulls, which was really cool. And they had a kids zone which Oscar could go into, which gives you kind of the kids easier access to the drivers who make special attention to hang out with the kids and get everything signed. So that was very cool.
Makes life easier.
Yeah, it does. It did. So there's a tip. Bring your kid to the F1 so you could get your autographs from your drivers. So Ricciardo, Norris, less so Sainz. He kind of came into it. But Ricciardo and Norris had this great battle all race. Right at the beginning, they were battling. Ricciardo initially got both McLarens, and I think Norris got him back.
Yeah.
And then about 3 laps later, Ricciardo got Norris. This great battle. I mentioned Norris goes on to a slightly different strategy to Ricciardo.
He hits again at the close to the end of the race for softs.
Yeah, and it was
interesting. A mad charge through the field.
He really did, didn't he? His pace, it seemed like a stupid move. He pits again for the 2-stopper, and you're like, oh, it's a bit late. But his pace was insanely fast. And so he came out, I think, around Kvyat or somewhere, down in maybe P12-ish, and proceeds to carve up through the field past his teammate and is fast charging in on Danny Rick. A couple of things happened there. First of all, Daniel got told that he was lifting off too much. So we mentioned those double-waved yellows because of K-Mag's brake failure at T12. So the drivers have to lift off there. And Norris made up about 2 seconds because he was lifting off less than Ricciardo, which is, you only have to lift off a certain amount. So Ricciardo was actually told, stop lifting off so much at T12.
Yeah.
And at the end, in that final turn, the delta was only a couple of tenths, and certainly one more lap, and Norris would have had Ricciardo, but he didn't. So Ricciardo came in a super strong P6. Hopefully won't be disqualified this time and can keep his points.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Hülkenberg, we mentioned, came in a strong P9 after doing that really long, hard stint at the beginning. I think like Ricciardo ran the tyres long in Mexico. I think Hülkenberg ran the hards the longest out of anyone. So a nice double points finish for the Renault boys. Good. Once again, struggle a little in qualifying. Obviously, Daniel's qualifying was okay, but the McLaren's certainly better qualifying car. But in race trim, not much to split.
They kind of fall off in race pace, sort of like the Haas. But
and we read something, didn't we, Oscar, where they said their aero degrades across a race. It's almost like the bits fall off it.
How does that happen?
I don't know. But we certainly saw here, I mean, Lando had a nice clean race. I saw him say afterwards, nice just to have a race where they didn't make any mistakes, in the pits, although the pits were slow, weren't they? The pit stops were slow.
Well, McLaren, every single pit stop was more than 4 seconds.
Yeah, and in fact, we should say that first stint when when Norris pitted first, Ricciardo responded, but he responded kind of 2 laps later rather than 1 lap later, and he was losing a lot of time.
Well, he wasn't losing that much time, though.
He came out less than a second in front of Lando, and Lando had a very slow pit stop.
Yeah.
So had McLaren done a clean pit stop for Lando, I would say that Lando would have come out in front of Ricciardo. Now, Ricciardo might have got him anyway because he seemed to have a bit better race pace, but
I think
would have
the
been
Renaults
interesting.
do have the best race pace of the field, though.
Yeah, meanwhile, let's... you think Renaults do, of the midfield?
Yeah. Well, no, yes.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think not much to split between the McLarens and the Renaults
sort of unrelated.
in race pace.
Just for a second.
Sure.
If you look at the P2 results, you'll see that they
practice 2. Frey practice 2.
It says P2. And so you'll see that the top 6 people are almost the exact same as the qualifying results, except the Mercedes and the Ferraris are swapped.
Yeah.
So instead of Vettel, Leclerc, Vettel, but all of the cars are in the exact same places as they were in qualifying.
Yeah.
And that was kind of amusing to me.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
I guess it really did reflect on how fast the cars were.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, the cars. Yeah, that's funny, isn't it? Yeah, it goes to show it was showing their true pace, I guess, except for the Ferraris who had no race pace whatsoever.
Yeah.
So, a little bit further back, other notable drives, Checo Perez.
Yeah.
Started in the pit lane.
Well, then he made up 10 places.
Yeah, and came 10th after a penalty. There was a little bit of argy-bargy between Kvyat and Perez right near the end. Kvyat was fuming, said it was just hard racing. He did basically run into him, did a little bit of his old torpedo.
And got a 5-second time penalty.
Yeah, and that meant Kvyat dropped out of the points yet again. Second race in a row where he got a penalty for last lap incidents after, you'll recall, Kvyat and Hülkenberg.
Gasly decided to DNF at the end. Just pulled in on the last lap of the race.
Yeah, I forget why that exactly was the case.
Hydraulic issues.
Hydraulics, thank you, Oscar. Yeah.
Or actually, no. We saw Kubica retire early on. And that was hydraulic issues, I think.
And Kvyat, we can't recall what that was, but he was out of the points.
Gasly,
he was out of the points anyway. Kvyat,
he still
losing
beat Russell
points
with his DNF'd car.
And Perez, that meant Perez picked up a point. Really good drive from starting in the pit lane after that earlier penalty for not being weighed or whatever it was. Very odd incident. Stroll, who in the early stages looked okay. Again, a nothing race. Raikkonen, kind of an okay race. He was looking racy there for a bit, but dropped down to P11 at the end, so just outside of the points.
Yeah.
Alpha's one of these teams, you've got to say this year, a lot of promise early in the season, and then just haven't won the development race. Have just dropped back and back.
One of those teams, I'm pretty sure that's the only team that's done that. All of these teams that are slow
Haas as well.
Have been...
Haas started relatively strong as well.
Did they?
Yeah, they were pretty good earlier in the year. They had that, and they kept going back to the Melbourne spec car. Remember, Grosjean's been going on about that. So, Haas and Alpha have been disappointing through the year. Toro Rosso have been looking a bit racier. McLaren, of course, has been the star of the midfield teams.
Yeah,
Renault, I think, keeping pace.
They might have gone down in performance a little bit, but...
at this... no, it's just about... you mean relative. But, I think... they have, because they're not going to finish P4 in the championship this year,
McLaren's
you would imagine.
already done that.
Yeah, I don't think it's... Is it confirmed? Can Renault not catch them?
Yeah, I think it is now
confirmed. So interesting. And then, of course, the Williams had a nothing race, nothing to talk about there. And we mentioned Gasly's DNF, Magnussen DNF'd, Kubica DNF'd, and Vettel, as we mentioned. Grosjean effectively came last to Giovinazzi, who rounded up the kind of bottom of the field there.
I mean, Russell came last.
Yeah, so... I mean, technically, yes, because he was out on track still, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah. And this was always going to be super hard for the Williams. They've got a high drag car. It's bad in high speed corners, and this is all about high speed corners and long straights I think
the Williams car is good for straights ish, though. Like the only time where a Williams scored a point was very lucky.
So, Oscar, give me your thoughts on... so we watched the race at the track, obviously very exciting. Then we actually came back to our hotel room and watched the race on TV, so to speak. How do you reflect on, being at the race versus watching on TV? Do you get the same view of the race? Do you feel the same kind of dynamic, or do you get a lot more on TV because you know what's going on? Or
I'd say you probably get... it's a better experience being at the race, especially for a race like that, which was kind of boring on the TV. Well, not boring, but not a great race.
Yeah.
And it was pretty exciting at the track. So, caveman answer is race good.
Race good.
TV bad.
I think that was really a case of where we were sitting at the track. Good atmosphere all around us. Yeah. Weather was beautiful day. And you can see quite a lot of the track where we're sitting, as we mentioned earlier. And that meant we saw, even things they didn't show on TV when there's little squirrely moments as people are going around corners and little tiny battles that they might not show on TV because they're focusing on the front runners.
We saw as well.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, I think you're right. I think it was one of those races where it felt like it went for about 15 minutes when we were at the track.
Yeah, it was really... Yeah. It felt short. I don't know why.
Yeah, whereas, typically on TV you get the kind of, first 10 laps are exciting as it kind of filters out who's going to crash, who's going to pit. And then until the next phase of pit stops, it gets a bit boring. Then, then again, it gets exciting towards the end. Yeah. Particularly this race, as we mentioned, the multi-stoppers, 2 stoppers or 3 stoppers were kind of carving through the field towards the end and catching up to those on one-stop strategies. That spiced it up a little bit.
So I have an award to give to this race.
Oh, please.
Stereotypical race of the year.
In what way?
As in, it's exactly what you'd expect from a race.
Oh, okay.
Everything about it. Some DNFs, some boring middle stuff. Strategy,
no good crashes,
some racing, no crashes. Well, that...
No safety car? There wasn't a safety car?
Okay, just...
I'm ruining this for you.
Yes.
But I know what you mean. Yeah. Okay, well, as we mentioned, Leclerc got the fastest lap in the end, 1:36.1, and Red Bull got the fastest pit stop, just over 2 seconds. Yep. And Alex Albon got driver of the day, as we mentioned, because your strategy is be a top tier driver in a fast car, drop to the back, carve your way through, you get driver of the day. And that's particularly a good strategy when it's your own fault because you crash into someone, a la Max Verstappen in Mexico last weekend, and he still gets driver of the day because of his own mistake. So it's an interesting view of the world. But I understand it from the public's perception watching the race. That's entertainment because you're watching a car carve through the field. So yeah, and you see them on TV a lot because they're doing a lot of overtakes. So it certainly skews the perception. Yeah. All right, Oscar. Any other comments before we bring this one to a close?
If you don't like going to races, then you're wrong. Go to a race.
Go to a race.
It's a good experience.
Yeah, it's been an awesome race weekend. We're still in Austin. Going to head back home tonight. But yeah, it's been an awesome race weekend here. Certainly, if you're in America, recommend trying to get to Austin. It's a wonderful event. Lots of things to see and do, and a great atmosphere. All right. Well, thanks for joining us. And as always, if you like our podcast, please rate and review us. And more importantly, tell your friends about it.
Email us, give us feedback, please, on our email, which is Formula1, the number, and son, which is and the word and, at gmail.com.
And we're on Twitter at Formula One and Son, and our username on Reddit is Formula One and Son. So yeah, feel free to reach out. We'd love to hear from you. If you're going to be at any events, we'd particularly like to get your impression of those events and tell us what you thought about being at a race weekend.
Yep, and now it's time for our own race weekend because we're about to go go-karting.
Yep, we're about to have our own little race. So
I will win.
Place your bets. Who will win? Will it be father or son? That's us from Formula One and